Welcome to Go Further Faster Open Guard. Of all the videos in this series, this was the most difficult, not because of the content, but because the topic itself is so vast that it was difficult to narrow things down into a manageable curriculum that you can apply in a competitive situation. The first great problem of your development in Open Guard is the complexity problem. There are so many options that there is a danger that you will react too slowly to be effective in a competitive situation. The way I urge you to overcome this problem when you start your Open Guard journey is to put your primary focus not upon a vast number of possible moves from Open Guard, but rather upon the much smaller number of principles that underlie success from Open Guard. In addition, there are a set of high percentage moves that express these principles and which have proven their effectiveness in the modern game at all levels, in all weight categories, for all body types. These should be your focus in training Open Guard. They are the focus of this video. The second great problem you will face is the offense-defense problem. As you are trying to attack your opponent from Open Guard, he will be trying to attack you with guard passes. The big question is, how can you reconcile your desire for offense with your need for defensive responsibility so that your attacks don't make you vulnerable to being passed? You must learn the notion of offensive and defensive cycles. You will need to learn the characteristics of an offensive cycle and attack only when engaged in an offensive cycle. You will need to learn the characteristics of a defensive cycle and learn to switch priority to guard retention and defense every time you enter a defensive cycle. In addition, you must learn to finish every defensive cycle in an offensive guard so that you're not permanently on the defense, but rather able to use counterattacks at the completion of every defensive cycle. In this video, you will learn techniques to cover the four main scenarios that you will constantly find yourself in every time you work from Open Guard. The first is where your opponent is on two knees. The second, where he is on one knee. The third, where your opponent is standing. And the fourth is where your opponent is in a split squat, often referred to as a headquarters position. By learning to use a small set of proven guards and high percentage techniques that express an even smaller set of fundamental Open Guard principles, in all four of these main scenarios, you will find every day you train, you become more and more effective in a short period of time and not suffer from paralysis caused by an overabundance of options. In addition, by learning to balance your desire for offense with your need for defensive responsibility, your guard will not be passed every time you attempt an offensive move, and you will be able to hold Open Guard position long enough to get the breakthrough on tough and skilled opponents. We're going to be going through a deep analysis of various kinds of guard position. Understand immediately that guard position is heavily emphasized in the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In fact, to a far greater degree in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu than any other style of grappling. There are a multitude of different grappling styles out there in the world. Probably the single most distinctive feature of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in comparison with the other styles of grappling out there is the incredibly heavy emphasis it puts on the idea of working from bottom position with your legs in front between you and your opponent, guard position, as one of the core elements of the sport. It's worth asking right from the start, okay, what is the actual value? What is the combat value of guard position? Because if you're anything like me, on your first day, when you first come into the sport of Jiu-Jitsu and you see guard position, it doesn't look very special. In fact, on the contrary, it looks kind of strange. It looks rather like something more from a Kama Sutra than it does from a combat manual. So what is the actual value of guard position? Why does Jiu-Jitsu put such a heavy emphasis on it? Why is it the most favored position if we're going to fight from underneath people? Well, part of it is just simple reality. If you get into a grappling situation with your opponent, there's almost always going to be a top athlete and a bottom athlete. Okay, one athlete is going to find himself underneath the other in some way, shape, or form. Now, there's a bunch of ways you can hold yourself underneath someone, and it's pretty clear over the course of the last 20 years of mixed martial arts. It is shown very clearly that there are two bottom positions which have proven to be the most effective in combat. These are guard position and turtle positions. Variations of these two have had by far and away the most success in bottom position combat sports. Anything other than those two tends to be very, very destructive. There's a reason why most people, even untrained people, generally favor top position in combat sports and fight situations. Guard position represents one of the very few positions where you can realistically expect not only to survive in bottom position, but actually actively go out and attack, even dominate and defeat an opponent. Why is this? What is it about your legs working from bottom position that makes it so effective? Well, physiologically, it's very important to understand the human body has a massive strength discrepancy between our upper body and our lower body. Think about how much you can push with your arms versus how much you can push with your legs, and how long you can do those two actions for. And you will quickly see that your legs are massively stronger than your upper body. Whenever we go to fight bigger, stronger opponents, especially from bottom position, as much as possible, we want to wrestle stronger people with our legs against their upper body. And that's exactly what guard position makes possible. If I have an opponent here in front of me, regardless of the kind of guard that I go to employ, it's going to be my legs working against my opponent's upper body. Okay, that's not an even fight. Even for someone who is bigger and stronger than myself, it's not going to be the case that their arms are bigger and stronger than my legs. And as a result, from situations like this, we can often go on the attack and go on to defeat opponents just because it's their arms versus my legs. So that's a big part of it. Another big part of it is the fact that once someone comes into my guard, they are very much limited in what they can do to attack me. As long as my legs form a barrier between myself and my opponent, they can never effectively go for upper body submissions. So, for example, if Mateus attempted a classic upper body submission and American lock while he's still inside my guard, he has no realistic chance of success. In fact, not only is he unlikely to succeed, because I can easily post on my training partner's hips and use my own hips to bring my elbow inside, but just the mere act of doing so has now made him extremely vulnerable and put him in a very poor position indeed. So too, when he went to apply, say for example, a kimura in a situation like this, it's very unlikely, even if the man gets a fully locked in kimura, that he'll be able to get my hand behind my back in a position like this. That's a prerequisite of kimura success. And it's very likely that I will be able to employ the strength of my legs to now put myself in a very good attacking position out to my opponent's side. So upper body submissions are very, very unlikely to work. In particular, strangulations are even more hazardous. If my opponent attempted, for example, cross-collar strangulations from a position like this, it would be almost suicidal and would only set himself up for failure. I'm in a position where I can use my legs to easily attack my opponent. Okay? So there's a sense in which the moment you get your legs between yourself and your opponent, he can really only attack my legs with submission holds. He can't attack my upper body until he gets past my legs. He can't attack strangleholds or take my back until he gets past my legs. So it's this incredible safety valve whenever you're in bottom position. It greatly limits what your opponent can do in terms of offense. So there's this first element is this idea that it puts the strongest part of your body, your legs, against one of the weaker parts of your opponent's body, his arms and upper body. And it greatly reduces the kinds of attacks your opponent can bring to bear against you. For reasons like this, guard position is by far and away the favored method of fighting from underneath people. Reality is, if you grapple long enough, you're going to find yourself in bottom position at some point. And it's up to you to fight from the best possible bottom position. And that, as we've been trying to point out, is going to be some variation of guard position. These guard videos will be essentially an attempt to flesh out a complete picture of how we can use these various guard positions to dominate from bottom position. What if I told you there was a fundamental contradiction built into the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that some of the prime directives of the sport clashed with each other? Well, there is such a contradiction within Jiu-Jitsu. No one ever talks about it. No one ever seems to address it. And yet it strikes at the very heart of what we're going to be talking about with regards to guard position. What is this contradiction? In your first day in Jiu-Jitsu, you probably got taught something like this. You must get some form of dominant position before you can attempt submission holds. This is one of the great cliches of the sport, and there's a lot of truth to it. Most of the time, we are looking to get some kind of dominant position before we can go into various kinds of submission hold. You hear this all the time. Even white belts can repeat it like a mantra. Position before submission. And yet, we get told, if we're in bottom position, we should be attempting submission holds from bottom guard. If there's other options too, you can sweep people, you can stand back up to your feet, but submissions from guard are a big part of the sport. Now, you should also understand that by its very definition, guard is a neutral position. If you look at the way guard is scored in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, this affirms immediately it is indeed regarded as a neutral position. If I come out at the beginning of the match and I pull guard, I don't score any points. No one considers the act of pulling guard going into a dominant position. There's a reason why guard pulls or escapes back to guard don't score points. It's regarded as a neutral position, not a dominant one. You only get rewarded for dominant positions. If I pass your guard and get into side control and from side control to mount, I score, because I've gone from a neutral situation to a dominant one. But if I just claw my way back to guard position from a bad situation, I score nothing. If I just pull guard, I score nothing. This is a recognition of the fact that guard is identified as a neutral position. Both athletes can do good things from there. Now, that should strike you as a clear contradiction. We get taught, first get dominant position, then attempt your submission holds. And yet, from bottom position, we're taught to attack out of a neutral position, guard. So there's a clear contradiction there. How we're going to resolve this contradiction is a big part of how this lesson plan throughout this video is going to be structured. The fundamental problem of guard position is that by its very nature, it's defined as neutral. But we are supposed to attack from dominant positions, from advantage situations or advantageous situations. So how are we going to resolve this apparent contradiction? The answer has to do with small movements, positionings, and placements that we can make inside a neutral position so that we can get some form of advantage within what would otherwise be a neutral position. A huge part of what we're going to be looking at throughout this video involves exactly this: the attempt to make small micro adjustments within a neutral position that can make it weakly dominant. And if I can achieve even a small measure of dominance, then I can attack with a much higher percentage chance of success. Guard position per se doesn't confer any great advantage, but certain adjustments I can make within a guard position definitely do create a sense of advantage. Our job throughout this video is going to be to flesh out what are some methods we can employ, some concrete, practical methods that we can employ to create advantage within what would otherwise be a neutral position. Now, if guard is, as it's defined, a neutral position, and we're only supposed to, in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, attack from dominant positions, our whole question is, how can we find dominance or advantage within a neutral position like guard? Let's have a look at some concrete steps that we can make. We'll be looking at these throughout the video. Let's give you a quick, brief, early look at some of them. Okay, working from a given guard position, in this case a closed guard. Here, I think most people would agree neither one of us has any kind of measure of dominance over the other, and the point system of jiu-jitsu reflects that. If I pull guard in a position like this, I don't score anything. It's 0-0. This starts to change, however. If I could take one of my training partner's arms and bring it across the center line, and then from here start to trap my training partner's arm across the body. Once the elbow passes the center line, for the first time, we start to get back exposure. Okay, as a general rule in the sport of jiu-jitsu, the closer we get to our opponent's back and the more angular advantage we can get on our opponent, the better things are going for us. And so by bringing the arm across the center line, we're starting to create a sense of advantage over our opponent, the advantage of back exposure. Okay. As I move further and further around behind my opponent, that measure of advantage increases to a greater and greater extent. Even if my opponent should go to recover now and start to bring his head back up, the arm position means that there's going to be a good opportunity now for other forms of attack. So, for example, a judogatame in this position. Okay. So once we start bringing arms across the center line, we're starting to create a sense of advantage over our opponent. So this is one very concrete sense, and we'll be spending a lot of time later on in the video on exactly this method of creating advantage. Another common, easily attainable sense of advantage is to get opponent's hands down to the mat. As long as his hands are in good grips on my upper body, like so, here he can be very, very effective. Okay, and he can quickly stand up and open up my guard. But if I can start to work to get hands down towards the mat, then things start to open up. Okay, once hands go down to the mat, now it becomes possible for us to shift our body into various forms of attack, which greatly facilitate attacks from bottom position. Another form of advantage goes in the exact opposite of pulling the elbow across the center line. When our opponent goes to react and pull away from that, very often we can start to extend arms out and away. And once arms go away from the center line, then we can go into other forms of attack out of this situation. Okay, from here, we'll be seeing that once arms get pushed away from the body and out to a side, then it becomes quite easy to go on the attack in various kinds of ways. So if we get a hand out to the side like so, away from the center line, that's almost as good as getting elbows across the center line. And from here, there's a vast array of attacks that we can go to work with. If we can get opponents' stance broken so that their head is lower than their hips, this too will confer a certain measure of advantage. So for example, if I'm able to get a solid collar grip on my training partner and he goes to stand up in my guard, from a situation where he goes to stand, if I can keep his head lower than his hips, this will confer a certain measure of advantage, which will make it relatively easy for me to go into various kinds of turning attacks, into arm bars, etc., etc. If my opponent finds himself in a situation back down on two knees, where I can take the lock of my feet from his lower back, which does very little to avert his posture, to one where I can get the lock of my feet over my training partner's shoulders, the so-called top lock. Now, we control much higher on our training partner's spine. Understand your opponent's spine as a lever. Now we're up at the end of the lever. When he tries to posture up and get away from us from here, it's very, very difficult. When I lock down here at the short end of the lever, it's very easy for him to posture up. But the higher my lock goes in these situations, the more difficult postural defenses become. As my opponent tries to pull up and away from me, we can easily control his movement in ways which will quickly set up various forms of submission hold from bottom. So these are some very practical and easily attainable methods by which we can take a neutral position like guard and make small adjustments in the position of our training partner's arms, head, the relationship between his head and his hips, his hand position, etc., etc. We'll be looking at these in great detail later on in the video, don't worry. And we can take a neutral position and turn it into a dominant position. It may not be dominant in the sense of the mounted position is a truly dominant position. The back position is probably the most dominant position. So there might be what we call weakly dominant, but that's fine. Weak dominance is better than neutrality. And we can turn a completely neutral situation and turn it into even a weakly dominant situation. Your attacking chances and success rates are going to start rising very quickly. Now, it's time for us to start going into the idea of being effective from bottom position in live training. Understand that there are 4 main scenarios in which you'll have to operate against an opponent when you're working from bottom position. What are these 4 scenarios? The first, and usually the beginning scenario, is where an opponent is down on 2 knees, kneeling inside your guard. This presents one kind of problem that we're going to have to overcome. That problem changes quite a bit when your opponent starts the action of standing up. Understand that most of your opponents will want to stand up in your guard, whether it be open or closed. When it's time for them to open a closed guard, they will almost always go to stand up, especially at the higher levels. And even in open guard scenarios, most of your opponents will be looking to get to a standing position where they have a mobility advantage over you. You're on your back, they're on their feet. That's a big advantage in terms of mobility for them. So understand that most of the time your opponents will start on the knees, but they're going to be looking to stand. When they go to stand, there's a transition, okay? And this is our second situation where you must be very effective. The first is where they're on 2 knees. The second is when they start the action of standing up. Understand that most of the time this is a 2-step procedure. Your opponent goes up 1 leg, and right about here, they go up to the 2nd leg. That transition, where they go from 1 leg to the other, is an area of the sport you must be very effective at. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time on how to deal with that transition. Now we go into the third element. This is where our opponent has actually stood up. Okay? Understand that there are 2 main differences that we have to work with here. The first, as we are now, Mateus has stood up, but you'll see that his body is bent over in a crouch, so that his head is about the same height or less than his hips. This presents one kind of problem. Okay. The fourth is where my opponent has not only stood up, he's achieved what we call vertical posture, where he goes up to vertical, and from here, his back is obviously in a perfect position now to go up and open my closed guard or to pass an open guard. So the 4 main postures, coming back down again, that we have to be effective against when we work from bottom position. The first is the kneeling posture. This is where most of the engagements start from, and you should be able to sweep someone or submit them effectively from this position. The second is where they go into the actual action of standing up. This is usually a 2-step procedure, 1, 2, and I should be able to attack them during that process. The third is where they've successfully stood up and they have either a bent over posture. I should be effective against this. This is the third kind of scenario. And the fourth, and potentially the most difficult one, is when my opponent goes up to a vertical posture. And from here, they can open a closed guard, they can start passing, they can do all kinds of things. Okay? And we must be effective against all 4 of these scenarios. So the 4 situations in which you'll be training throughout this video: against a kneeling opponent, that's one kind of problem you have to overcome. Against someone who's transitioning to their feet, that's another kind of problem you'll have to deal with. Third, where they've actually stood up successfully, but they're bent over, that's a certain kind of problem. We'll look at how to deal with that. And then the fourth, where they've stood up and they've achieved a vertical posture. Our job is to make you very effective in all 4 of those scenarios, because on a daily basis, you're going to have to deal with all 4. Now, we're about to start getting into the actual nuts and bolts of attacking from bottom position and working effectively from underneath a tough opponent. One of the key elements that's going to run throughout this video and throughout the rest of your time in the sport of jiu-jitsu is your ability to manipulate this, the gi. Okay. So often I see people teaching the sport of jiu-jitsu, and they do a fine job demonstrating the moves, even concepts, principles, etc., but no one ever sits you down one day and tells you how to grip the gi for maximum effect. When I look around me all the time, I see people wearing the gi, but I see very few people truly using the gi. There's a massive difference between putting the gi on and actually using it to maximum effect. And a big, big part of whether you can use the gi to maximum effect is how you grip it. The gi, in a sense, is just a mechanism that enables you to maximize gripping effectiveness on an opponent and he upon you. So a big part of your ability to succeed in the sport of jiu-jitsu is your ability to grip this uniform with maximum effect. Let's start off by just talking about, okay, how we're going to change you and make you a more effective gripper in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Probably the single most effective or the single easiest element for a human being to grip since the dawn of time has been some form of rope. Okay, if you look at when you want to exert a strong pulling force upon something in nature, we almost always do it through some kind of rope effect. Understand that ropes that we use every day for pulling, climbing, etc., can be mimicked in the jacket. There are certain elements of the gi which enable you to use similar pulling forces that you would on a rope for maximum traction in whatever pull that you want to impart upon your opponent. Let's investigate this now. When you look at the construction of a jacket, you're going to start to notice a few things about it. There are certain parts of the jacket that become very similar and create a rope-like effect that you can use with tremendous effect to control an opponent. Okay, I'm going to point out some of the more obvious ones first. The more obvious elements of the rope on a jacket are the lapels itself. Okay, if you look at the lapels of a jacket, they mimic rather closely the effect of a rope-like object, the belt. The lapels are essentially a belt woven into a set of sleeves. And just as a rope can be pulled tight, etc., crossed, or what have you, so too can this lapel. If you face me. And so the lapel provides a rope-like effect which can be used with tremendous effect upon an opponent. Okay, it's literally like a rope around your opponent's head and shoulders. And it can be used just as a rope can be used to impart a tremendous pulling effect. It can lift you right off the floor. So too, it can be used on an opponent to lift and move him right off the floor. So that's the most obvious rope-like effect. Okay. The second one, if you just tuck everything in, is your opponent's belt itself. Okay. The belt provides a rope facing this way, which can be used to impart enormous control over your opponent's center of gravity, the hips. Okay, when he tries to move away from me, this is just an incredibly powerful mechanism to draw people in. Okay, even when he walks away on his knees and tries to move as far away from me as possible, it's just such an easy way to pull someone in using that belt. Okay, so the lapel and the belt are the two most obvious senses in which there is a rope around your opponent's body. One is around the head, the lapel, and the other is around his hips and center of gravity. So understand this right from the start. When someone puts a gi on, they have a rope around their head and they have a rope around their hips and center of gravity. Now, what are the two most important parts of the human body to control when you want to control someone? It's the head and the hips. And so the gi presents an opportunity for you to put enormous amounts of control over an opponent through these rope-like effects of the lapel and the belt. One for the head, one for the hips. Now there's a third element of a rope-like effect woven into the gi, which is much less obvious. The belt and the lapel are pretty obvious, but there's a third one. It's much less obvious. This is the idea of a seam that runs down our opponent's sleeves. Okay, the seam of the jacket, regardless of manufacturer, runs down the back of the sleeve, like so. It presents a thinner rope, but it's a rope nonetheless, and it can be exploited with tremendous effect. Notice that the rope runs the length of the arm. I can grasp the seam right down here by the sleeve cuff, and when Mateus goes to pull his arm away from me, it's incredibly difficult. Okay, it's an enormously strong control of my opponent's arm that enables me to completely control his hand. If he went, for example, to grip my hand, he could never get to it because I control the hand itself through his jacket. And if I want to move his arm or take him out of balance, it's so easy using this grip. Okay, so too, I can go higher on my opponent's sleeve and come up here to the tricep. Now, when I grip the seam, I'm controlling the shoulder. I'm much closer to the shoulder now. So when I pull, the shoulder is taken out of position. Okay, so this too presents a rope on the back of my training partner's shoulders. When I control both of them, now I have complete control. You can see a line of tension running between my two hands, which gives me complete control of Mateus's two shoulders. When he tries to pull away from me and walk away, it's almost impossible. And we have a tremendous ability to turn his shoulders from one side to the other and create push-pull effects. Okay, so this is another sense in which the seam functions as a rope, and you must learn to exploit it. Predominantly, this will be done at the cuff here and at the tricep here. Okay, now there's another seam running through the jacket, which is again even less obvious but equally important. There is a seam that runs down the back of every sleeve, and there is also a seam that runs around the cuff of every sleeve. We have to be able to exploit this cuff. When I grip, it's like a rope around the end of my training partner's wrist, so that when I turn up and he goes to pull away, you'll see a line of tension runs through my training partner's jacket. And we can use this to completely control someone's ability to pull away from us and disengage. So we get an initial grip, we turn it and create a line of tension running through our training partner's jacket that gives us tremendous control over our training partner's arms. Understand that I am not allowed in this water jiu-jitsu to put fingers inside my training partner's cuff. So we must always work on the seam on the outside, 4 fingers on the outside like so. And as a result, we now completely control our training partner's hand. When he goes to grip me, it's so difficult. You have complete control. When he goes to yank away from me, it's so difficult. Okay? My whole body, if Mateus stands up and walks away from me, my whole body will move along the mat before the grip itself breaks. It's an incredibly strong and robust rope-like effect that we can use. Okay? So let's quickly summarize the 4 ropes of the gi. That just as we employ a simple rope to climb and exert tremendous pulling strength in everyday life, and we can do it here in jiu-jitsu. The first and the most obvious is the lapel. That's essentially a rope around our training partner's head. When he tries to pull away from us, almost impossible. And we can use it to both pull and push to control our opponent's head and shoulders. The second is the belt, which is a rope around my training partner's center of gravity and hips. When he tries to walk away or move any kind of, it's so easy to draw him in using the belt. It's an incredibly strong control over your opponent's body. The third is the seam that runs down the back of every sleeve. And we can exploit this either at the end of the lever or up here at the shoulder girdle. And this provides tremendous control of an opponent with both pulls and pushes. The fourth is this, the seam that runs around the cuff, and this provides hand control. When my opponent goes to grip you, it's so difficult, and when we want to grip them, it's so easy. Okay, so these are the 4 ropes of the jacket, and you must learn to exploit them for what they are, an incredible mechanism by which you can control the head, the hips, and the arms and shoulders. And as a result, if you can control all 4 of these, you're going to start controlling people very, very well on the mat. And if you can control them, you can finish them. Now, understand that these are the main epicenters of grip control when we work with the jacket. But the true magic of the jacket, and indeed the pants as well, is that we can use a different form of gripping, flap gripping, which enables us to manipulate and control any part of my opponent's body that is covered by the material or cloth of the gi. What is flap gripping? This is where we take 4 fingers and we use a thrust into the jacket to create a flap of cloth, like so. It doesn't matter where you go. You can go literally anywhere on the jacket. 4 fingers go in and create a flap of cloth. Now, as my opponent goes to pull away, we use that flap of cloth. In this case, I've chosen the elbow. Okay, when he goes to yank away, it's such a difficult thing. Now the elbow belongs to you, and you can start moving people around the mat. Okay, if you come in this direction, Dennis, we can use this at the pocket of our training partner's jacket. Here, I take 4 fingers and I put them in, and I create a flap of cloth. When Mateus goes to pull away from me, now I don't even have the lapel. We just have the flap of cloth. And as a result, we have tremendous pulling and pushing control of our opponent. Okay, you turn around in this direction, please. I can use this gripping here, 4 fingers thrust into the back, and as a result, we create a flap of cloth. When he goes to pull away from me now, you've got tremendous control of your opponent. Okay, and you can easily start moving people around the mat. You can use this in any way, shape, or form. From the pants, I go in 4 fingers, create a flap of cloth, and now I have a complete grip. If Mateus tries to walk his leg away from me, you see that I have complete control of it. Okay, we can use this to create a simple flap of cloth on 100% of the surface area of the body covered by the jacket to create instantaneous control. Okay, it's a tremendously effective method to come in and make grips on people. This does not rely on any rope-like effect, but rather on a flap of cloth. Here, I create one at the back of the shoulders. So I take 4 fingers, thrust in, lock, there's a flap of cloth. Now, as we go to moving around, you'll see that I have complete control of Mateus's 2 shoulders through this grip. And as a result, we can start to turn people and get them out of balance. Okay? So, when it comes time to grip the gi, the 2 dominant strategies that we go to employ are first to employ the rope-like elements of the jacket. These are the lapels, which control the head, the belt, which control the hips, the seam that controls everywhere from the hand to the shoulders, and the cuff seam, which gives hand control. Then, as a distinct category of grips, we can use flaps of cloth, which are created when we take 4 fingers and thrust them anywhere into our training partner's jacket and create a flap of cloth, which gives control of that area that we happen to have gripped. Here I've chosen the forearm. He goes to yank away, and you see it's almost impossible. Okay? And so by gripping in this manner, you can get tremendous pulling and pushing power on the entire extent of your opponent's body. Once you understand these subtleties of gripping, you're going to become a much, much more effective player down on the mat. I often have my students warm up before class just with simple gripping drills, which we usually practice in the standing position, where they will come out and just make grips upon each other, and they just practice coming out and getting a good grip and setting the grip through motion and playing with the grip in various ways. And they grip up in various ways, shapes, and forms to get good control of their opponent and walk around with each other just like so. Now you can see my hands are working in an efficient fashion. I found 2 rope-like effects on my opponent. When he goes to yank away from me, see we have excellent control, and as a result, we're going to move the opponent around the mat and exert tremendous positional control over him. Okay? All of these same gripping strategies work just as well down on the floor. When I lock up like so, when he goes to pull away from me, it's so difficult. And from here, we can be very, very effective from bottom position. We just practice these various kinds of gripping movements, controlling the rope-like elements of the gi, or creating flaps of cloth from where we can go to push, pull, take people out of balance, etc., etc. Understanding how to truly use the gi is a huge, huge part of your development. Focus first on identifying and manipulating the rope-like elements of the gi. As you gain an expertise, start experimenting with creating flaps of cloth using a 4-finger thrusting grip, which will make any part of the gi an effective push and pull instrument. And you can use these in a multitude of different ways that we'll be looking at throughout this video. Now, let's go into what I believe is the most significant part of this video. Most open guard videos will simply show you a collection of moves, and that's fine. You learn a few moves here, you learn a few moves there. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But in truth, I could sit here all day and show you open guard moves, and none of them will work in a competitive situation with a resisting opponent, because they lack the key ingredient that truly makes the moves of open guard and the position in general effective. This is the notion of kazushi, or off balancing. Let me put it to you this way. You can know a given move and be completely unable to apply it in a live situation because your opponent's stance and balance is strong. It's extremely difficult to apply even the most basic moves of jiu-jitsu in someone who's in a strong stance and strong sense of balance. But it's incredibly easy to perform those same moves on someone whose stance is broken and they're out of balance. That's going to be the determinant of whether you're successful or a failure from open guard. Can you break your opponent's stance, and can you break his balance? This is referred to as kazushi, which applies to the idea of breaking both stance or balance. Now, you'll often hear people say, okay, balance breaking is important. I understand that. And then they never teach it to you. They never give you the concrete steps that actually enable you to break someone's balance under pressure. You hear people throw the word around, kazushi, it's really important. But they never actually show you how to generate kazushi, how to create it. I want to do exactly that for you now. I want to show you the concrete steps that actually enable you to take a resisting person and break their balance, break their stance. I'm going to do it first in a general way, and then I'm going to show specifically how to do it from each one of the various guards that we employ throughout this video. Because I promise you, if you can break a man's balance, you can do whatever you want with them in an open guard situation. If you can't break their balance, chances are they'll do everything they want to pass your guard. Let's start off with just the notion of the raw materials of breaking someone's balance from an open guard situation. The fundamental raw materials that you must work with are the shoelaces of your feet and the soles of your feet. Your shoelaces can be used to pull on an opponent's legs, and the soles of your feet can be used to push on an opponent's legs. And between the pull and the push, you can create substantial amounts of kazushi on an opponent and start tripping and off-balancing them very, very quickly. If we have a standing opponent in front of us, when we use our feet, stand, feet apart, when we use the shoelaces of our feet, it's important we develop the idea of flexing our toes back towards ourselves so you can form a hook on a training partner's leg. When we go to pull the leg, 9 times out of 10, the geography that you're working with is that between the knee and the ankle. That's where we do the pulling. When we do the pushing, we contour the sole of the foot around our training partner's thigh, and we work between the hip and the knee. So when we push, it's typically between the hip and the knee with the sole of the foot. And when we pull, it's typically between the knee and the ankle with the shoelaces of the foot. And between these two, you'll be pleasantly surprised what kind of a pull you can get to off-balance someone and what kind of a push you can get to off-balance someone. Okay? Now, if that's the raw material we work with, what are the symptoms of kazushi? What lets you know you've been successful with a kazushi on your opponent? Simple. If you can put his hand on the mat, you've knocked him back in a way where he had to stabilize himself with a hand, then that's been a successful attack on your opponent's balance. If you can make your opponent take a step, that's a successful attack upon your opponent's balance. If you can drop him to a hip, that's a successful attack upon his balance. If you can drop him to an elbow, or in extreme cases, down to his head, those are very successful attacks on his balance. But 9 times out of 10, what it requires for you to say you've been very successful with some kind of kazushi attack upon your opponent is the ability to put his hands on the mat or to make your opponent take a step. I'm going to say that again because it's extremely important for everything you do from open guard. You know you've been successful with some kind of attempted kazushi upon your opponent if you can make his hands touch the mat or make your opponent take a step forwards or backwards. If you can do those two things, you're gonna be very, very successful from open guard situations. Okay, so let's start looking at this now. Okay, from any given situation where I have an opponent in front of me, from any given guard, one of the most desirable things I can do is to be able to determine where and when my opponent is stepping. So for example, if I'm holding him like so and his foot is far back, I can make my opponent take a step towards me, make your body as resistant as possible. You don't want to be stepped forward. If I pull my left hand to my right hand, he's got to take a step. Okay, so that would be a good example of kazushi. If my opponent doesn't take a step, he's going to fall flat on his face. So the fact that he had to take a step to recover balance means I broke his balance. Okay, so there's a sense now in which I am determining where he stands. Okay, and if I can command where he stands, I'm going to have an easy time taking my opponent out of balance and knocking him down to the floor. Okay, this can be done in different directions. So for example, from danaher situations, okay, if I have a grip on my opponent, doesn't even matter which side we're gripping. From here, if I can push on my opponent and get my man stepping backwards, now we can come up into situations where we can go on the attack. Okay, so I'm forcing him to take a step backwards. So this would be another example of forcing my opponent to take a step. Here I use the sole of the foot to push, and as a result, we're able now to force my opponent into a stance that he didn't want to adopt. I forced him to adopt that stance. And as a result, from here, we can go on and continue in various kinds of attack. So if I can make my opponent step wherever and whenever I want, that's a huge thing for my success or failure from open guard. Okay? If I can trip my opponent using either the shoelaces of my feet, like so, or using the soles of the feet and off balance my opponent's hands to the mat, that's a huge, huge thing. Okay? I'll say this again. If you can snap your opponent's hands down to the mat at will, and if you can make your opponent take a step either forwards or backwards at will, you are going to be highly successful from open guard. You are going to find it's very easy to employ all of the moves that I show you throughout this video. If you can't do those things, you'll win some, you'll lose some. Sometimes the move will work, sometimes they won't. Okay? We're going to look now at each one of the specific guards that we use throughout this video and show how kazushi is used for each one of them. Now, we look at the idea of kazushi. We've stated it's incredibly important and that the successful application of all of the moves that we're looking at from open guard in a live competitive situation almost always relies on your ability to create an off balance in your opponent that either forces a hand to the mat, drops their ass to the mat going backwards, or forces them to take a step to catch their balance. If you can do these things reliably against tough opponents, you're going to have a lot of success from open guard. Let's quickly look at some of the main forms of guard that we're going to be using throughout this video and just show the most basic elements of kazushi so we can snap hands down to the mat, drop them on their butt or put a shoulder down to the floor, break their balance in some way and make them step forwards or backwards. This is going to be the raw material that you work with to apply the moves later on in the video. So let's look first at the guard which I'm suggesting throughout this video is the single most important open guard that you work with. This is on a standing opponent, and we have a cuff grip on one side. We have the cross collar grip, just like so. And from here, I have a foot in my training partner's bicep. So when my opponent goes to pull away from us here, you have excellent control of the head through the cross collar grip. You have excellent control of the lead hand here, which controls my training partner's elbow. And you have excellent control of the far elbow through your foot on the bicep. If Mateus goes to pommel his hand out, we have to make sure that our foot, moving around, our foot follows our training partner's hand. I kind of set my foot stationary and he just goes right through and controls it. So always you want a sticky foot right here in the bicep and elbow. Okay? Now, this foot can change position. It can be starting here on the bicep, but at any given moment, I can just place my foot here on my training partner's thigh. Notice that when I do so, I contour my foot to Mateus's thigh. I don't just put my heel where it can slip off. I don't put my toes on where it can slip inside. I physically grab his leg, just like so. And look how easy it is for me now to simply push on my training partner's thigh and snap his hands down to the mat. Okay, it's just such an easy thing for us to do. And this will set up almost all of the main attacks that we work with from this position. So let's say we start off with an opponent here, working from guard. He goes in to grab my gi pants, for example, and from here we're snapping grips off and moving around with our training partner. We get a foot in place, we move our way up, and we go into this position here. As he bases out and gets into a wide, powerful, strong base, we're looking to break his balance and get his hand down to the mat. So we place our foot on board, and then from here we just push, and we snap the hand down to the floor. Once his stance is broken in this way, you're going to find it's very, very easy to go into a wide array of attacks from this position that we'll be looking at later on in the video. Okay, so that's a simple method of attacking. I often refer to this as Hisaguruma. Okay, Hisaguruma is normally done as a throw in the standing position, where we get a hold of a training partner and we block our training partner anywhere around the knee region, and as a result we're able to go through and block and knock the man down to the floor. Okay, but it can also be done down on the mat. The idea is that we push. Hisa means knee. We push on our training partner's thigh just above the knee and move our opponent around and stumble them down towards the floor. So here we are. We start off. He's got his feet far back. We're working in a fairly standard kind of open guard situation. We just place our foot right there at the knee, push, and as a result, we're able to take that man out of balance. Whenever we make the push, you want to make sure it's a push and not a kick. We never kick our training partner. It's always a good, healthy push that brings his hand down to the mat, and that's going to lead into all of the various switches, moves, etc., that we employ from open guard situation. So that's a simple, practical way to get our opponent's hand snapped down to the mat in this very, very common guard situation. Another obvious candidate here is danaher guard. When we work from danaher guards, we've got our foot locked around our training partner like so. We could have any vast number of different grips from here. We could be gripping the gi pants, gripping the sleeve. There's a vast number of ways we could work. But once again, we can take our foot and place it right here on our training partner's thigh. And that same principle of pulling with our cross lapel grip and pushing on the thigh with that Hisaguruma type action. And as a result, we can snap our opponent's hand down to the mat. In addition, we can create situations where gripping a hold of sleeves, we can make the man take a step in a given direction. I push and I step, I make him step backwards, and as a result, we're able to come up and into various forms of attack from open guard. So these are simple ways in which, from a danaher type situation, we can get our opponent's hands down to the mat by pulling here, while we apply the Hisaguruma action. Or I can not pull so much, just push, and as a result, we can go from a danaher type guard to a sit-up type guard, okay, and work from this position. So again, we're getting the man stepping where we want him to step, we're snapping hands down to the mat, and we're getting that man out of balance, okay? Another classic example of making people step, getting them out of balance, occurs in spider guard situations. Now, we're going to be looking at quite a few different variations of spider guard. Here's a commonly seen one, where we have a straight collar grip and a grip here on our training partner's sleeve cuff, and as a result we're able to get into this grip here just like so. Okay, from situations like this, it's pretty easy for us to get our opponent stepping and moving. If his feet are far back from us, it's not a difficult thing for us to use this action to get that man stepping, getting hands down to the floor, making him take a step forward with his feet, and as a result we can easily snap hands down to the mat, and from there, as a result, we'll be into various forms of attack from open guard situations. We can change this into double cuff spider guards, and once again, from situations like so, it's not difficult for us to make our opponent take a step forward on a given side and get those feet moving, and as a result, we're determining where and when he steps. Okay, this can be extended when we go through and add the idea of a lasso guard. And from here, once again, we can even step people all the way down to a shoulder. They come back up to their feet. Now you're really breaking their balance, okay? You're not just getting hands down to the mat. Now you're getting shoulders and elbows, even foreheads down to the mat. The idea is, as I get an angle on a given training partner, from here it's not difficult for us to start sending the man over and breaking balance in ways where we bring him all the way down to the floor. X guard is another fine example of a given guard where I can snap my opponent both forwards and backwards, make them take steps, snap the hand down to the floor, and exert considerable kazushi control over an opponent. So if we start off in a classic X guard type situation, we have our hand here, around our training partner, blocked above the knee, a foot behind our training partner's knee like so, and our legs forming the shape of an X. From here, it's not a difficult thing for us to bring knee and ankle together and extend and lift our training partner's foot and force the hands down to the mat. Okay? I can trip my opponent backwards and make his butt touch the floor just by sliding the foot down and breaking his balance backwards. It's an easy thing from here to make our opponent take a step away by extending, or by bringing knees into chest to take a step in towards us so we can bring a foot closer and knock the man down. So X guard 2 is a classic example of a guard where by extending my legs or contracting my legs, make my opponent put a hand on the floor. By tripping with my feet, I can put his buttocks on the floor. By extending or contracting my legs, I can make him take a step forward or back. So once again, from the classic X guard situation, we're in here and here. Look how by lifting and extending, I can snap both hands to the mat. By dropping a foot down, we can make him snap down to the buttock. And we can make an opponent take a step away, just like so, and we can make an opponent take a step towards, like so. And as a result, it's an easy thing for us to knock that man out of balance. So too with Ashigurami. From a situation where I have an opponent standing over me, it's an easy thing from here to create strong off-balancing with Ashigurami. Look how by turning out in this direction, I force his buttocks and a hand down to the floor, and we knock that man down to the mat. Another way we can use it, I can place my foot in the cross buttock position and bump forward and force his hands down to the mat and force him to take a step forward with his legs. As he goes in to recover, now we can knock him backwards. And by applying forces in these different directions, you're forcing your opponent to take a step, snap a hand defensively to the mat, or drop to his buttocks on the floor. If we can do these things reliably from the various guard positions that we're going to be using throughout this video, force an opponent's hand to the mat, force an opponent to sit down to a buttock, force an opponent to take a step, you're winning the Kazushi game. If you can do these things consistently on your toughest opponents, you're going to find all of the moves that we employ throughout this video are so much easier to apply and so much more successful in their application that it will transform your open guard game. I urge you to make a serious study of this idea of Kazushi. Know that success consists of snapping hands to the mat, dropping your opponent's butt to the floor, making them take a step to recover their balance. If you can do these things, you can win from open guard. Now, another crucial principle for your open guard development is the feet off the floor principle. I don't care how strong, tough, well-balanced your opponent is. If you get his feet off the mat, that's a serious problem for your opponent. Okay, if you can lift your opponent's feet off the mat, unless your opponent is extraordinarily skilled and talented at returning to the ground in good position, 9 times out of 10 you're going to sweep them over and get your points. It's just a huge advantage mechanically to take your opponent's body off the mat. Remember, there's 2 things in grappling we've got to be connected to. You've got to be connected to your opponent, and you've got to be connected to the floor, because those are the 2 things that enable you to exert control over an opponent. The moment your opponent's feet and body leave the mat, one of those is gone. And now, unless he has extraordinary skills, he's going to fall as a result. The quintessential example of your opponent's feet leaving the mat is going to be Tomoe Nage. There are many other examples, but Tomoe Nage is the one we focus on in this video. The idea is simple. As long as my opponent's feet are rooted to the floor, as long as my opponent's feet are rooted to the floor, he has some degree of base to work with, okay? And there's some degree to which he can keep his balance above me. But the moment we get in on a training partner and we start taking his feet up off the floor and he loses that critical connection with the mat, that's when things start going south for our training partner, okay? Once the feet come up off the floor, you can turn a man in any given direction, and you can land him on your left side, you can land him on the right side. At this point, you pretty much own your opponent, okay? There are counters here, there's handstand counters out of it, there's cartwheel counters, but these are difficult to employ, and rather easy to counter on my end too. But in a situation like this, where we put our training partner over, feet off the floor is just never a good thing mechanically for your opponent. It just completely subverts his ability to create a base of support underneath himself and recover from the initial sweep attempt. Another classic one here, if I have a standing opponent on top of me, a shin sweep. When we get double shins and here and get a hold of both of our ankles, a common thing here is people go to grab our lapels. Not a bad response on their part because now it connects them to me, okay? And as a result, it's a little harder for me to knock them down to the floor. But you can see in situations like this, it's not a difficult thing for me to take my training partner's 2 feet off the mat. And once the feet go off the mat, I don't care how hard he holds on to my lapels. I don't care what he does with his base. He's going for a ride. He's going to fall down, okay? In the case of even the humble tripod sweep, if I have an opponent working here in front of me, there's ways to manipulate a tripod sweep where I can get both of my training partner's feet off the mat, okay? If I have my opponent like so, and I take his foot and physically lift it up off the mat, while I take his second foot and physically lift it up off the mat, you go from a fairly innocuous looking tripod sweep where typically only one, this is a standard tripod sweep now, one foot comes off the mat and the guy falls, okay? But you can greatly increase the amplitude and the effectiveness of the tripod sweep by actively pulling both feet off the mat at the same time, and you'll notice you get a much more dramatic sweep, which is far harder for your opponent to counter and resist than a standard one. Anytime you can get your opponent's 2 feet off the mat, it's money in the bank. It's going to be a tremendous addition to your overall effectiveness sweeping people from open guard. When you can get those feet off the mat, do it. A truly important principle in the application of your sweeps from open guard is going to be the double direction principle. This is the idea that the most efficient applications of forces upon our opponent are typically what are referred to as coupled forces, where you have a force going to the east and a force going to the west at the same time in different locations. Okay, it creates very strong turning forces upon your opponent. Just as 2 hands on a car wheel, when you want to turn a car rapidly, better to have 2 hands going in, one pushing, one pulling in opposite directions, creates a much stronger turn than a single hand on the wheel. So too when we go to sweep people. If I just put a pushing force on my opponent in one direction, that's one thing. But if I put a pushing force on one part of his body and a pulling force on the other, we tend to get much better reactions. So for example, if Mateus is on front of me on 2 knees and he puts his knee up, like so. If I just make a strong stance, Mateus. If I just push on Mateus with my right hand, okay, that's one thing. Okay, I'm pushing him, I'm exerting a good force, but you can see the application of force is not particularly efficient insofar as it doesn't create a coupled force on the man. But if I have a pushing force on one part of his body and a pulling force on another part of his body, now even small applications of force will drop the man down to his butt, okay, because we have a push with one hand and a pull with the other. Whenever possible, we want to employ this principle of coupled forces or double direction forces, okay, 2 different forces in 2 different directions at the same time on 2 different parts of his body. This creates tremendous turning effects on an opponent, which are very, very difficult for my opponent to stop in terms of sweeping potential. So if we have a training partner on 2 knees, a classic example of double directionality in forces might be, for example, a spider scissor sweep, where we put a foot here in our training partner's bicep, and from here I come down to the side and onto my elbow. As my training partner's elbow goes high up above his head, and I just look in the direction of the sweep where I want my training partner to land, you can see I've got a left foot pushing over here to the east and a right leg hooking over here to the west, okay, so that one foot is pushing in one direction, the other foot is hooking in the other. And as a result, you get a very strong turning force that knocks our man down to the floor. Okay? So that would be one fine example. Any form of scissor sweep is always going to be a very good example of double directionality in operation. In sumigeshi, if I get a hold of my training partner and I put my training partner up into a tripod position like so, here my left foot is exerting a force in a given direction, okay? But if my right foot comes out and hooks onto my training partner's legs, so that as my left foot lifts to the east, my right foot goes to the west, and we knock him down very, very easily. This can be done in many ways with sumigation, okay? So anytime we get this opportunity to exert a force in one direction and then use another part of our body on another part of his body to go in the opposite direction at the same time, that's money in the bank, okay? You're going to get much better sweeping effects using this method than just applying a single force on one part of your opponent's body. Look for double direction whenever you can. It's a vital, vital part of your open guard development. Another truly important principle with regard to your development from open guard is the arm trap principle, and this too figures heavily in this video. The idea behind an arm trap is that whenever you go to sweep an opponent from open guard, his primary forms of defense are to base out with a leg or an arm in the direction of the sweep. Okay, so for example, if I'm going for a standard form of sumigashi, down the knees, on a training partner, if I control the arm, he's got to base out with his leg. If I don't control the arm, he'll just base out with the arm and kill the sumigashi right there. Okay? So you can see what happens here. Whenever you go to sweep a given opponent in a given direction, he's either got to post out with a leg or an arm in the direction of the sweep. The arm is one of the best methods for my opponent to post out. In the case of sumigashi, I need my opponent's head to be lower than his hips for a successful sweep. When I can do that, I'll put the man over every time. But when my opponent can put his arm successfully on the floor, I can never get his head lower than his hips. And as a result, the move is now doomed to failure. I'm going to have to switch off to something else now. Okay? But what if I were to take my opponent's arm on a given side and trap it across my center line, like so? Now he would have no capacity to base out on the side of that trapped arm. In this case, it's Mateus's right-hand side. If you can ever get your opponent's arm across the center line into an arm trap by any given method, I'm demonstrating one now, you're going to be able to sweep a lot of people. Okay, I'll demonstrate it on the other side so you can see from the camera. Here I have an opponent in front of me. I go through and I take my training partner's hand across the center line. I bring him in, chest to chest, and I lock my training partner's arm in place. If Mateus tried to pull his right elbow out, it's blocked by my elbow. All I have to do now is take his hips up higher than his head. So when Mateus reaches for the floor with his feet, he can't make contact with the mat. From situations like this, Mateus has no capacity to base out with his right arm. He can try to base out with his right leg, but it can't reach the mat because I'm holding his hips higher than his head. And as a result, the sweeps come so easy off these arm traps. There's just no real line of resistance. And as a result, we get beautiful sweeps to the mat, regardless of how you do it. It's coming on this side now with this. There's many different ways to do this, but they all have a common feature. Our training partner's elbow going across the center line. Okay? Regardless of whether I attack with straight sumigashis or a yoko sumigashi in this case, the arm is trapped across my body. Okay? When Mateus tries to base out, it's so difficult on that side. He knows I'm sweeping to the right, but the right arm is trapped across my center line. So there's no basing out on his part. If he tries to base out with the right foot, it's inadequate. You can easily take the man over in the direction of his trapped arm. Whenever you can trap the arm across the center line, you will always find that sweeps in that direction are radically easier than in cases without a trapped arm. Use the arm trap principle from open guard whenever you can. It's particularly important in situations where your opponent is on two knees. It's mostly utilized in cases of sumigashi or hook sweeps, which we'll heavily emphasize in this video. Again, whenever you can get an arm trap upon your opponent, use it to sweep in the direction of that trapped arm. You'll soon find your sweeping percentages radically increase with the use of this excellent, excellent sweeping principle. Another crucial principle, which often manifests itself in open guard sweeps, is the action-reaction principle. As you learn the various sweeps from open guard, there's a natural tendency that we all have to try and perfect the mechanical details of the move to the point where you can break through resistance and just sweep your opponent anyway. That's a good thing. That's an important part of your development and not something you should avoid. However, there's also the reality that our opponents are very talented and they know the same moves and they know the resistance to them. They know how to stop and counter them. So there has to be a development on your part insofar as you want to perfect the mechanical details of the move, but also recognize the reality that when you run into a sufficient level of resistance, you've got to go with the resistance rather than just try to smash through it. This becomes very, very important as the level of your jiu-jitsu increases and the level of your opponents increases. So, for example, I have a standing opponent in front of me. From here, I'm working with double koji, okay? When I pull my training partner in towards me, my intention is to pull him onto my open guard. Now, Mateus knows that, and so very often what he'll do is start a strong pullback reaction, okay? And perhaps he might even try to go and break my grips now by taking two hands on and popping the hand off, okay? You can see what's happening here. I'm trying to pull Mateus onto my open guard. My intention here may be, for example, to pull him into ashigarami, okay? That might be one thing I could do here. I could pull Mateus in and from this position, fire up into ashigarami, and then go for our various attacks from here. So, you know, you hit the move successfully 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and Mateus is highly intelligent and very skilled, and he starts to realize, okay, I see what he's trying to do. He's trying to pull me into his ashigarami. So when I make contact here, he starts pulling away from me, and you can see the weight is going onto the heels. What I need is Mateus's weight on his toes. That's what makes it easy for me to take him out of balance and pull him into whatever open guard I want to, okay? So Mateus recognizes this, and he starts a defensive action where the weight sinks onto the heels, the buttocks come down, and from here he pops my grip off, boom, and now he's successfully resisted the move that he saw me trying to employ. And this is the eternal pattern of jiu-jitsu. You're trying to employ a move on an opponent, he knows what the move is, identifies it, and correctly counters it, and you go from there. That's, as you go higher and higher in rank, the game just becomes more and more about dealing with that kind of scenario. So when I feel that initial resistance on Mateus' part, and I feel his weight sinking back, this is the perfect time now to go with his resistance and knock him down in a backwards direction. I wanted to take him forwards. He exerted a force in a backwards direction, and rather than just try to pull, I went with his line of resistance, and we've knocked him down and we've scored, okay? Remember, guys, the ultimate thing here is to score. No one cares what you score with, so long as you score. You had an original intention to score with ashigarami. It got stopped, and you scored with double kouchi. You still scored, just not with your original intention. That's the pattern you want to work with, okay? Always looking for an initial attack that creates a reaction in your opponent and you feeding off that. So, for example, we've got Mateus on 2 knees here in front of us. I would love to be able to go in and score my opponent's belt and attack with sumigeshi, okay? If I can successfully cover my training partner's hands in these situations, then sure, we can go in and score with sumigeshi. Now, Mateus knows I need to cover the hand and arm. So as I attempt the sumigeshi, he plants that hand out on the mat and stops my sumigeshi. Okay, rather than just try to horse it through from this position. Okay, I go through underneath my training partner's arm and change the position like so. So I've seen a defensive reaction and it's fed into something else. Now we could go for another form of sumigeshi, utilizing a different grip, the shoulder crunch, and from this situation, it's pretty easy for us to send the man over. Alternatively, I could go for right sumigeshi, and Mateus stops me. Okay, and then right from here, I could just sit back in the opposite direction and switch left sumigeshi and end up with a successful sweep. So as I feel the defensive reaction to my right, I feed off that. As he pulls to my left, I switch and I go left sumigeshi. Okay, this constant action-reaction is a big part of successful open guard games. Now let's understand that there are 2 main lines of force with action-reaction. There is forward and backward, and there is side to side. So, for example, we looked initially at a standing opponent. Here, because of the standing nature of the action, typically most of the action-reaction is forwards and backwards. Okay, I'm trying to pull him forward onto various forms of guard. I'm demonstrating ashigarami, but it could have been any other kind of guard. And Mateus, his lines of resistance are backwards. My attack is forwards, his lines of resistance are backwards, and bang, we knock the man down to the floor. Okay. When we're down on the knees, on the other hand, usually the lines of resistance tend to be more side to side. Okay. So as I attack left sumigashi and my opponent bases out and resists, then from here they can come up and then make a switch into right sumigashi. Okay, so as a general rule, standing opponents tend to be more forwards and backwards with action reaction, and kneeling opponents tend to be more side to side action reaction. That's a general rule, but it's not a bad one for you to operate with. Now, this forms another of our critical principles that you must build your open guard game around: action reaction. Yes, get good at the mechanics of a given move. But when you run into heavy resistance, don't try to use the same move and just hammer through any level of resistance. Be alert to the fact that as your opponent exerts defensive forces in a given reaction, in a given direction, you can follow that defensive reaction and score very, very well through the principle of action reaction. Now, one of the most important principles that we employ from Open Guard, and which is crucial for your development in this aspect of your game, is the idea of wrestling reversals. When most people begin the study of guard position, they work on the assumption that there's a top player and a bottom player, and the bottom player should stay on bottom until they get a successful sweep or a submission hold. As a result, there's almost like a gentleman's agreement, where the bottom guy just works from bottom, from his back or from his buttocks, and the top guy works to pass, and the bottom guy looks for sweeps and submissions, and they keep going until one of those occurs. There's nothing in the sport that says that because you start in the bottom position, you can't come up aggressively from bottom and wrestle your opponent down. In fact, this is one of the absolute most high percentage ways to operate whenever you play open guard. Because very often, most forms of open guard initiate with a pull. You're always trying to pull people towards you. So, for example, if I have a guy standing over me, most of the common grips involve pulls on your training partner's lapels, which will enable you to pull him into danger, where you can go in for your attacks and start scoring. Okay? So as a result, because most of the bottom game involves pulling, there's a tremendous pull-back reaction from most of your opponents. This creates an action-reaction sequence where you're trying to pull them in, and they're always trying to posture up and pull away. Whenever that occurs, there are going to be a vast number of cases where you're going to be able to come up, just on two knees for now, you're going to be able to come up from bottom position. As I feel this man pulling back, you're going to be able to come up and go into takedowns that are normally associated with the sport of wrestling, double legs and single legs. Okay, you must be aware of this possibility in your open guard game. Again, don't think because you start in the bottom position that you are condemned to always staying in the bottom and just working patiently for your sweeps and submissions. There's nothing to stop you coming up and tackling that man down, either with singles or doubles. You must make this a big part of your game. Now, the main option you have is between double leg attacks and single leg attacks. If I have an opponent here in front of me, best of all is where we catch a hold of both of our training partner's legs. Okay? When you get a hold of both of your opponent's legs from here, it's very hard for them to actively resist you. And it's pretty easy for us to keep the two legs together and start getting strong reaction, wrestling reversals from bottom. Single legs are easier to get to. It's easier to get to one leg than it is to get to two. But double legs are generally much easier to finish. Now, a natural question for you to ask is, well, wait a minute. I never wrestled a day in my life. How am I going to be able to do this? I don't have a strong double leg. I don't have a strong single leg. Well, I got good news for you. Most of the classic defenses to double legs and single legs involve sprawling the legs back, at least as an initial reaction. But when someone's down on the floor, it's actually very difficult for them to get any kind of effective sprawling action going on because their knees are already on the mat. So when they go to sprawl, it's typically quite easy for us to drop them over and get them to the hip. Now that would be significantly more difficult if my training partner was standing. In situations where he's standing, I feel the full weight of his sprawl. As the legs go back and back and back, it feels like it's hard work for me to go from here. But if the knees start down on the mat, the knees are so close to me now that when my opponent goes to sprawl, you have such good control of the knees. It's far, far easier to put kneeling or sitting opponents down than it is to put standing opponents down. And even in situations where you have to work against a standing opponent, you've got some good things in your favor. The truth is, you're sitting on your butt, so you've already level changed. The most difficult part of getting in on the legs is a successful beating of your opponent's hands, a good level change, and then going into the legs. When you start in a guard position, the level change is already there. All you've got to do is go forward against that opponent who's already reacting backwards. If you get a hold of two legs or even one leg from there, the takedowns are much easier than they would be in a classic wrestling context, where you have to beat your opponent's stance, you have to get past his head, hands. It's a difficult thing. But when my opponent's standing over me, and we're in a situation where I'm trying to pull him in, for example, and he's pulling back, it's going to be very easy in situations like this to knock the man down. Okay? So the general point we're saying here is, just because you start on your back or buttocks doesn't mean you have to stay there. There's nothing to stop you coming up from a sitting or a supine situation and coming up to your knees and wrestling for reversals. Even if you're an inexperienced wrestler, the conditions, once you get to a leg in groundwork, are significantly easier than they would be in a standing wrestling situation. So don't carry some kind of inferiority complex around with you. I never wrestled, so I can never hit a double leg. Well, maybe not on the feet against a good wrestler, but if it's someone your own level and they're standing above you, it's actually quite easy to get to a leg and finish on a leg. This is one of the most high percentage ways to operate in competition. Because as I said, 90% of guard attacks begin with a pull. So as we feel our opponent pulling back, and we feel the backwards reaction, that's exactly when we can come up and start dropping people and coming up and scoring either one leg or two for the knockdown and the score. You must keep your mind open to this very, very effective pattern of attack of wrestling reversals, where we create conditions where we can enter with takedowns normally associated with the sport of wrestling, single legs and double legs, from a guard position, and use it as a reversal to score points in the same way you would for conventional jiu-jitsu sweeps from guard position. Now, we're looking at the foundational principles that underlie most of the high percentage sweeps from open guard. One of the most important grounding principles is that of double trouble. Understand that double trouble is a very general principle that extends throughout the sport of jiu-jitsu. You see it in the case of leg locks, arm locks, guard sweeps, and takedowns. The idea behind double trouble is that whenever you go to attack one limb of your opponent, whether it be with a submission hold, whether it be with a sweep from guard, whether it be with a takedown from standing position, whenever you go to attack one limb, 90% of the resistance to that attack will come from the other limb. So if I go for an arm lock on my opponent's left arm, 90% of the initial resistance comes from the right arm. If I go for a heel hook on my opponent's right leg, 90% of the initial resistance comes from the left leg. If I go for a single leg takedown on my opponent's right leg, 90% of my opponent's initial defense will come from the left leg. So too with sweeps. If I sweep on one of my opponent's legs, say for example the left, 90% of the initial resistance will come from the right. So this general principle extends throughout the sport. We're looking at it in this case with open guard sweeps. Let's look at a classic attack, a sweep on one of my opponent's legs out of, say, ashigarami. So if I have a standing opponent on top of me and I get into an ashigarami position, okay? Once we get into the ashigarami from here, you can see that I have my training partner's right leg under my control through the ashigarami, okay? If my opponent were naive and didn't know much about improving his base of support, then it's pretty easy for me just to put pressure inside my training partner's knee and knock them down to the mat, okay? But as you get better and better opponents, someone like Mateus here is not going to just accept the ashigarami. He's going to take his head and move in this direction. He's going to connect himself here to my lapel. And from this position, when I go to tip the initial ashigarami, he's going to use the second leg to step in a series of small hops in this direction. So as his head position improves and he balances on his second leg, look how as I attack Mateus's right leg, his left leg becomes a source of base and balance. So as I attack, he steps and steps and steps, and I can't get him down. Okay? You can see what's happening here. I launched a sweeping attack on one of his legs, and the second leg provided all the resistance and enabled him to stay above me and keep his base. So an obvious point here is, well, what if I was able to get to that second leg and control it? Well, then the sweep would be far more successful. Okay? So we're going to start with the same initial grip, ashigarami. Okay? But I'm going to take my second hand and I'm going to go through and control my training partner's second leg. I can do it using the gi pants, or I can do it just holding the heel itself. Now I'm going to apply exactly the same move, and my opponent's going to do exactly the same defense. He's going to lock on tight, he's going to bring his head down, and he's going to try and hop with the second leg. But of course, I'm controlling the second leg now. So when Mateus goes into his standard defense, he trips and falls very, very easily. I applied the same amount of pressure. I didn't try harder than I did in the first move. But because I was controlling both legs instead of one, my opponent fell down very, very easily. Guys, I can't emphasize enough to you the importance of double trouble as a general principle throughout the sport. And this video, focusing of course on open guard, it's particularly important. I'm going to give you a little piece of advice here, which you can take for the rest of your time in jiu-jitsu. I don't care how athletically talented, how tactically sound, or how experienced your opponent is. If you get a hold of both of his legs and you exert a pushing force backwards, he's going to fall down to his ass. It's that simple. It's just pure physics. Okay, you can show me the guy with the best base, the best reactions, all of these things, wonderfully talented athletic specimen. If I get a hold of both of his legs and I push him backwards, he will fall. There's no getting around that. So as often as possible, whenever you can, try to get a hold of both of your opponent's legs and exert that pushing force. At the very least, you'll knock them down to their butt. You may not always get up on top and score the points, but you will at the very least put them in a defensive framework where they're scrambling to prevent you scoring advantages or coming up and scoring points. There are many, many examples of this in operation. I just showed one out of ashigarami. Another classic example would be a tripod sweep. Okay, if I have an opponent here in front of me and we get a hold of our training partner like so, I have a foot here which provides a pushing force on my training partner. I have a hand here that traps one of my training partner's ankles, and I have a foot here behind my training partner's ankle. So when I push on my training partner, when Mateus goes to defend himself in situations like this, it's just so hard to prevent the knockdown because both feet are controlled. Okay, if we have a standing opponent here in front of us, another classic example here would be, say for example, the square stance Mateus, double kochigari. Okay, again, the emphasis here is on trapping both legs. Okay, when I go in and make an effective trap behind both of my training partner's legs, it's so hard to prevent the knockdown. At the very least, they're going to fall down to their buttocks. And from there, it's up to us now to control the end of the scramble by controlling the legs and making sure that we come up and score our points. Okay, there are myriad examples of this throughout the sport. Okay, if I had, for example, an initial grip on my training partner just like so, and I come down and get a hold of both of my training partner's ankles here, we can hit a simple shin sweep. And my opponent goes down to the mat, and once again we find ourselves in situations where we can come up and make our score. Anytime you see this opportunity to get a hold of both of your opponent's legs and exert a pushing force in a backwards direction, take it every time, because that is one of the absolute surest ways to knock a tough, talented, knowledgeable opponent down to their hips and create situations where you can score from open guard. Throughout this video, we're going to be looking at many, many ways in which we can manifest this important principle. Make it one of your grounding principles when you sweep from open guard.